Alright guys, so welcome to episode number 5 of essentially my YouTube tech channel, and for episode 5 we're going to do a very special video on a very special and hot phone right now, and that is on the Google Pixel 4a. Let's get started. Alright, so the question we're trying to answer today is the Google Pixel 4a, Google's latest iteration of their budget phone, a worthy competitor to other phones in the segment like the super hot iPhone SE 2020, the Samsung Galaxy A51 and A71, or even the more expensive OnePlus Nord that just came out as well? Let's find out. Okay, so like always, we will start with some background information, then we will get into the hard specs of the phone, and finally we'll wrap it up by giving some comparisons, and then we'll talk about if the phone is actually worth it or not, and if you should spend your hard-earned cash on the 4A. Okay, so here's some background info on Google's budget phones in general. So the Google Pixel 4a, as you might know, is Google's second generation of their own budget phone, excluding Nexus products in the past. This is actually the second budget phone that Google itself developed and created. The first obviously being the Google Pixel 3a, which was released all the way back in April of 2019. So it has been well over a year since Google has followed up the 3a. So that's why this phone is essentially so highly and hotly anticipated by not just tech enthusiasts, but real consumers as well. So the Google Pixel 3a back in April of 2019 started at a price of $399, which was obviously it was budget pricing, and that was really important because more and more phones at the time were getting so much more expensive, especially flagships, and if people didn't want to spend like well over $1,000 on a phone, they had to have an alternative, and the Pixel 3a was one of the first truly like competitive and hot budget phones that came out in a while. And obviously the reason for the Google Pixel 3a's cheap price was because like other budget phones in the segment, it basically removed everything that was unnecessary, gimmicky, or simply just way too expensive. So as a result of this, well, you could call it cost cutting, the Pixel 3a had a plastic unibody shell. It had a Snapdragon 670 chip, which obviously was nowhere near a flagship level chip. It was one of the cut rate chips made by Qualcomm at the time. It didn't have the best screen on the market. Granted, it was 1080p, but it wasn't like a mind-blowingly good screen, and it was pretty small with pretty big bezels as well. Okay, back to the video. The Pixel 3a also didn't have a very big battery or the best battery life, but out of all of these cost-cutting measures, Google did focus on basically what Google does best, and that is the camera. So essentially, the Google Pixel 3a had an unheard of camera in this price bracket, and it really just blew all of its budget competitors out of the water. And truly the most impressive thing by far of the Pixel 3a's camera was that it was a camera singular. There was only one camera, and it was still able to pull off such amazing photos. Okay, so here is the moment you guys have been waiting for. This is the design of the brand new Google Pixel 4a, and taking a look at it, it does obviously again have a unibody plastic shell, but that might not necessarily be a bad thing because plastic is so much more durable than metal or glass. And I think that is what people in this segment are looking for out of a phone. So I think it's good that it still does have that plastic build. And I also do think it looks way more clean and it's not so apparent that it's a plastic body. Also, as of now, the Pixel 4a only comes in the just black color. However, the 4a does still have Pixel's signature colored power button, which in the case of the matte black Pixel 4a is a minty green color. And I think Google giving you only one color option really just speaks to how simple they want to make this phone and how easy they want the process to be of just buying the phone. They don't want to throw a bunch of color options at you, and they don't want to throw a bunch of spec options at you either, which we'll get into later. Oh yeah, and the Pixel 4a also still retains the headphone jack. What more can I say? Another very refreshing feature in 2020 that the Pixel 4a still keeps is the fingerprint sensor on the back of the phone, which I think is honestly the best way to do smartphone biometrics by far. I think facial recognition, it could still get faster. And in-display fingerprint sensors are also, they still need a bit of tweaking, but overall, I do think the fingerprint sensor on the back of the phone is a very smart move on Google's part. Anyways, let's get into the more unique features about this phone, because as of now, I've been just talking about features that are refreshing to have in 2020, but let's actually take a look at some unique and interesting features on the 4a. Alright, so if you look at the back of the Pixel 4a, you can clearly tell that it has a very typical camera square that we expect in 2020 on all phones pretty much. And you might be wondering, did this phone pack in 3 cameras or 4 cameras to follow the trend like most other phones are doing? And the answer surprisingly is no. Google actually skipped out on putting multiple cameras, and they again, like the Pixel 3a, just put in one camera, which, I mean, Google kind of tricked us there because in such a big camera square, they only managed to put in one camera. That's kind of weird, but the lack of multiple cameras shouldn't be a problem in the 4a's case. At least I don't think it'll be a problem because as we saw with the Pixel 3a, that also only had just one camera, and it was still able to pull off such amazing photos. And I have absolutely no doubt that the Pixel 4a will still pull off great photos because pretty much every Google phone that has come out so far has never disappointed in the camera department. It might have in the video department, but stills-wise, I think it still is at the top of its game. And let me just mention here the reason why Google phones have such a great reputation in the camera department and why they always impress is not always in the hardware department. For example, the Pixel 3a did not have the best camera hardware, but the reason that it was so good was that Google's software optimization and pipeline are just so advanced and so good at this point that really no other manufacturer can catch up to them. And really the reason why Google's cameras are so great is just the software experience and the processing. And speaking of software, I'm sorry it's raining right now. There might be a lot of background noise. Just excuse that, please. And speaking of software, the Pixel 4a obviously runs completely stock Android, which to me is absolutely a major selling point of the phone because so many budget phones these days and pretty much always have really bad bloatware and they pack in random apps that you'll never use. But the Pixel 4a, having completely stock Android, will not only not have any bloatware, but it will also support updates for I think up to 3 years, which is really good in the budget phone segment. And Pixel 4a also does include some of the really impressive and amazing software features that some of the more higher end phones and flagship phones have from Google, like the Pixel 4a, for example. So it does have the amazing night sight feature, which I think is one of the best night photography features in the entire smartphone industry. And if not that, it is definitely the best night photography feature in the budget phone segment, and it is very comparable to the OnePlus Nord's night photography feature, and maybe even better. And speaking of the OnePlus Nord, please note that the Google Pixel 3a and the OnePlus Nord aren't exactly direct competitors, because the OnePlus Nord has quite a bit higher starting price than the Pixel 3a, so you shouldn't directly compare them. You can in some aspects, but don't expect to find them exactly equal on everything. Anyways, other features that the Pixel 4a has software-wise is the amazing call screening feature, which is really useful. It has multiple Google Assistant features. It can transcribe voice memos, song recognition. It goes on and on. Google's software is clearly just really good, and I think they've come close to perfecting their software. And so far, these all really add up to making a very competitive phone in the segment. But I do have to note some downsides to this phone, because there are a couple, and most of them are on the hardware side, which is to be expected for an A phone, because usually they don't really pack in the best hardware, but we'll get into that. So let's actually get into the hard specs and hardware of the phone right now. So let's start with the displays. The display is a 5.8 inch, which is actually fairly small for this class, 1080p 60 hertz display, which is not the high refresh rate display like the OnePlus Nord's 90 hertz display, but I'm sure not many people who are looking to actually buy this phone are that interested in. So that is excusable. And note that the OnePlus Nord, as I've mentioned previously, is way more expensive than this phone. Also, the 4A has a pixel density of 443 ppi, and it does have the typical hole punch selfie camera cutout, which is fairly typical for this class. It's better than a notch for sure, and it's way better than the huge bezels that the iPhone SE 2020 has, which are just downright dated and ugly. And while we're talking about the display, I should note that this display is pretty average for the segment. It's pretty good, and it's certainly better than the 2020 iPhone SE's display. So if you really are looking for a great display or just a competitive display in the segment, I would avoid the 2020 iPhone SE and I would consider the Google Pixel 4a. Interestingly, the Google Pixel 4a actually weighs a couple grams less than the iPhone SE, even though it's a bigger phone, but that less weight is due in part to the plastic build, which is unlike the iPhone SE's, which is a metal and glass build. So to wrap up the hardware of this phone, let's talk about the actual internal specs of the phone. So this phone has a Snapdragon 730G chip, which is actually pretty good for this class, but if you're comparing it to the 2020 iPhone SE, it is way less powerful, actually, like way less powerful than the 2020 iPhone SE. If I can find the benchmark specs of the two phones, I'll put it on the screen right here. Other than that, the Pixel 4a has 6 gigs of RAM, 128 gigs of storage, and it is worth noting that none of these specs are upgradable, so you basically get what you get, which, as I was mentioning, with the only one color option of this phone, does add to the simplistic nature of it, because it only comes in one color option, none of the specs are upgradable, so it is just a very simple experience overall, with a focus on the camera. As for the battery life, the Google Pixel 4a has a 3,100 milliamp hour battery, which is a pretty big battery actually, considering this display is not like the most stressed display. It is a low refresh rate display, and it certainly will be better in battery life compared to the 2020 iPhone SE battery, because that phone only has just over 1,800 milliamp hour display, which is very small. And in the real world, this battery should absolutely last you a full day of moderate usage, but if you're looking into doing heavy stuff, it might not get you through a full day. But I think for most people that are buying this phone, the battery life is nothing to worry about, and Google is actually marketing this phone as having good battery life. So I guess Google did make an effort to make the battery actually good in this phone compared to the previous Google Pixel 3a, which did not have an impressive battery or battery life whatsoever. Alright, so I've been holding back till the end of this video to talk about probably the most important feature on this phone, the main reason why anybody who's looking for a cheap phone should buy this phone immediately, and that is the camera, of course. Okay, so actually, if you take a look at the hard numbers of this camera specs, it might look a bit underwhelming to you, to be honest, because it does actually look very similar to the previous year's Google Pixel 3a, which in and of itself wasn't the most impressive camera hardware-wise. But as for the actual sensor, the Pixel 4a still does retain the 12 megapixel single sensor that the Pixel 3a had. However, Google did make some software tweaks to this phone to give it more natural colors, better low light performance, and also I should note that this camera does now have a very unique and cool zoom feature, which allows you to zoom further in while still retaining most of the details. I won't go into the exact details of this zoom feature, but just note that it will enhance the quality of zoomed photos if you zoom in with photos often. And also keep in mind, this is all still being done with just one camera, which is very impressive to me. If you really do take a look in real life at the pictures that come out of this phone, or even the 3A, you will be super impressed, and you will be questioning, how is a budget phone able to pull off such great photos out of a camera? And this camera honestly can put other mid-tier like OnePlus Nord and even flagship cameras to shame that have 5 different cameras, and basically Google was just like, forget it, we're using one camera and that's it, that's what you get, and we're still going to pull off amazing photos. But as much as I am praising this camera, I really do wish deep down that they would have included an ultra wide camera, which would have been so cool and so impressive. And I bet they could have pulled off some really cool ultra wide features. And in general, I just wish that they could have done something to the hardware that also made you go wow, but they didn't. And it's still fine by me because Google can still pull off great photos with their cameras, just not the best video quality. Keep that in mind. If you're looking to take great video, you should highly consider the iPhone SE 2020. But clearly, Google does still have, hands down, the best software in the game. And even though it doesn't have the best hardware, it still has that incredibly cheap price tag, which I am waiting to mention because it's so impressive. Okay, so here is the moment you guys have been waiting for. Now is the time to talk about the price of this phone, and it will really impress you guys. So, wait for it. The Google Pixel 4a starts at $349, which actually undercuts the Google Pixel 3a, which started at $400, which is just truly impressive. It also undercuts, obviously, the $400 iPhone SE 2020 and the estimated to be around $500 OnePlus Nord, which is just really crazy. And this is probably one of the best values in the segment for just the amount of software features it offers, the incredible unmatched camera again. So I think it's a great value. And yeah, it is definitely true that the Pixel 4a doesn't have at all, you cannot say that this has anywhere near the best hardware features or specs, but those really don't matter to most people in the segment. And I honestly think that most people are looking for a better camera than they are looking for better internal specs like a better processor. That's just my opinion. And yeah, it is very apparent the moment you start looking at the phone and feeling the phone that you are not looking at a flagship phone. It is still a plastic build. It still doesn't have nowhere near the material quality or the build quality as the iPhone SE. However, it is actually very refreshing to see a phone these days that is so simple and so focused on just one thing. And I think that is maybe what will sell this phone, because it doesn't pack in a bunch of crazy gimmicky features. It doesn't pack in like 10 million things that you'll never use in your ownership experience. It just makes everything so simple, from like the color of the phone to the software experience. It's all simple. So the moment you open the phone, you're not going to be confused at all. Anyways, it has been a very thorough review of this phone, and I really enjoyed making this video on the brand new Google Pixel 4a, and I can't wait to see what other phones that Google will have in this budget segment in the years and future to come. But if you guys like these types of videos where I talk about budget phones and phones at this price range, give this video a thumbs up. And if you did really like this video as much as I did making it, also give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of